Hello, and welcome to the Family Histories Podcast, the show for those of us sat quietly in libraries, archives, and spare rooms all around the world, tirelessly piecing together our collective social and family history. My name is Andrew Martin, I'm a family historian, and I'll be your host. In this episode, the Plaiter, we'll be hearing about a woman whose highly skilled work was met with ridicule. And then we're looking for clues to the parents of a woman seen in 19th century Highgate in Middlesex, England. So, put down that old diary, grab a cuppa, and let's meet our guest. My guest today is a family historian, author, lecturer, a one-name and one-place studier, and a president. And she also spends time living in the 16th and 17th century too. So, quite frankly, I don't know how she has time to be here today, but I'm very glad that she is. It is, of course, the wonderful Dr. Janet Few. Hello, Janet. Welcome to the Family Histories Podcast.
Hello, Andrew. Thank you very much for inviting me.
You are absolutely welcome. Now, I normally start with the same question of how you got into family history, but I think I need to start with the when do you find time to sleep question.
Not very often, I think is the answer. Yes.
I'm not surprised with all those things that you do or you have achieved.
No, I tend to get up very early in the morning, and that's probably when I'm most productive.
Fair enough. Yeah, longer days. So let's step back a bit and find out what it was that initially got you interested in researching family history.
Well, I was very, very young when I was first interested.
Okay.
So about 20 years ago, I wish. So I had a very unusual maiden name, and I had a very, very small family. So I have no siblings. I have no first cousins, and I only have second cousins on one of the four possible sides. So really no family at all.
Right.
And what I did have was a wonderful collection of photographs for my mother's side of the family. And I had a baby book in which my parents had written a 4-generation family tree. Mm-hmm. So really, I've been interested since I was about 7.
Ah, okay. So you had kind of these documents from one side of your family.
Yes, just the one. Very little on my father's side.
Yeah. So how did you kind of go about researching the other part of your family then?
Well, it was difficult because my father died when I was 9.
Right.
I did have 2 uncles who were not a great deal of help, as one of the pieces of misinformation that I was given will come up when I talk about my life story ancestor.
Oh, okay.
But what I did have were family stories and family rumours. Certainly on my father's side of this family, there was this myth that we were descended from people who were wrecked off the coast of North Devon during the Spanish Armada.
Okay.
Total rot. On my mother's side, we were allegedly related to the Smiths of Smith's Crisps.
Okay.
My mother's maiden name is Smith, and they came from London, so everyone has my sympathy, really. But that was, in fact, true.
Oh, okay.
So, yes, I think that's appeal. But the serious research didn't start until I was a late teenager when able to go to archives and things.
Sure.
For my father's side.
Yeah. And when did you, or how did you learn to research?
It was quite difficult. I mean, we're talking a long time ago. So certainly long before anything was online, There was a television programme where Gordon Honeycomb, the newscaster, researched his family history. And I think there was a book by Stella Colbell about how to research your family history, which came out round about that time. But it was probably another 2 or 3 years before I was in a position, for example, to join a family history society, which was something that were just starting up at that kind of era.
Yeah.
So it was very much self-taught.
What was your family's attitude to you researching family history?
Very positive.
Good.
My mother had all sorts of stories. My great aunt, again on my mother's side, equally so. They weren't always quite right, but there was mostly something in there somewhere. There's names incorrect in the family photo album. There's people who were conveniently forgotten in the family story because they ended up in an asylum and things like that. But there was quite a lot of information and they were very positive.
So what do you think your kind of favourite part of researching was that maybe was what got you hooked?
I think it was finding a family because I hadn't got one. And as a very small child, I had all these imaginary brothers and sisters. Oh. And I suppose it kind of moved on from that, really. And suddenly there were real family members. Okay, I never met them and they were pretty distant, but it was fun and I enjoyed it. And I always enjoyed history. I enjoyed history at school, and like a lot of family historians who hated it, I did like history all along.
So maybe this is why you ended up doing a one-name study and some one-place studies as well then, I guess.
Yes, I think so. And the one-name study that I'm actually registered for is my children's ancestry and not mine, but I'm also very much involved in somebody else's one-name study, which is a very long-standing one, which relates to my maiden name.
Okay.
So I've been doing that for a long time.
Is that not, generally kind of the one-place studies, I always think that would be nice to do, but I think that it would distract me from doing my family history. How do you kind of rationalise that?
Well, theoretically, I have 4, and only one of those is related to my ancestry.
Okay.
And when I started it, it was only, I hope this is related to my ancestry because I haven't quite inked these ancestors in yet, but I have now convinced myself that I have got enough evidence to do that.
Okay.
So the others were where I lived or just places I've got an interest in, but they definitely enhance your family history because suddenly you're putting your ancestors into the context of the place where they lived. So who were their neighbours? Who did they go to school with? Where did they go to school? What leisure facilities were going on? Did they belong to the local tennis club or the young farmers or whatever it might have been? So I think it really can help set your ancestors in some kind of context.
Yeah, that's a good point. Back in season 2, I spoke to my guest Ruth Bramley, and she does what she calls historical recreations, where she wears period-style clothing at events and she demonstrates crafts like weaving. And I'm aware that you also do interpretations in costumes. So how did you get into that?
Well, I blame family history, really. When I moved to Devon about 20 years ago, I was involved in organising a Guild of One-Name Studies conference in North Devon. And we were aware of a tourist attraction locally, which was based on the battle of the English Civil War. And we wanted them to come and be a speaker because we'd been there as tourists and we liked what we saw. So I went and asked, and they said, well, actually, we're very short of staff at the minute. So I said, rashly, if I volunteer, will you come and talk at our conference? And so that was it. So the 17th century at that point wasn't really a period that I had taken any particular interest in or had a great deal of knowledge about.
Oh, okay.
So that's how it started. That tourist attraction subsequently closed. And then I carried on with a couple of colleagues on our own, obviously rather differently because it was without premises. But by then I'd written a book about the 17th century and I was doing lots of talks about the 17th century. So Mistress Agnes, as she's called, was here to stay.
Wow. And so I guess you'd probably say that the 17th century is your favourite era, or?
Well, I'm a bit of a butterfly, really. It depends what day you ask me, because I find it all fascinating. So sometimes I think, I'm passionately interested in this. And then people say, well, what's your PhD about? And nothing to do with the 17th century at all. That's 19th century, well, basically emigration, which turned into a little bit of a study involving nonconformity. So absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with 17th century. So when people say, well, what's your subject? I'm like, well, history. I don't care what it is. Not very keen on political history. The sort of war and more war stuff I'm not so keen on. But anything social history, I'm in.
Wow. So if you could go back in time, perhaps, to give your earlier self one research hint, what would it be?
Oh, gosh, there's so many, isn't there? I think to make sure you always write down exactly what you found, where you found it, and what you haven't found. Because we're very good at saying, I found this, that and the other. But what have you actually looked for? Because believe me, I'm nearly 50 years down the line now with this. And would I remember? Probably not. So you do need to write down everything, including those negative searches, which is where I think most people fall down.
Yeah, I don't think I'm keeping a note of those. So I've learnt something today, listeners.
What happens then is 10 years down the line, you go and do exactly the same thing. Yeah. And guess what? They're still not there.
Yeah. Do you remember your first breakthrough?
I think probably, I mean, as I say, we're going back a long way. So everything was very slow. Everything was very manual. And I think managing to find my paternal ancestors in the 1851 census, I think, opened up a lot for me. Yeah. And also a very interesting will on that side of the family. It was the first one I ever had. It's still the most fascinating one I've ever had, and rather spoilt me for all the others, which just say, I leave everything to my wife. But so that, I think, was probably the first real breakthrough where I started to find out things that I didn't already know because I'd been told about it.
And how do you share what you're researching with your own family?
Well, I try. I write it up as much as I can. I'm very good at telling other people to do this, slightly less good at doing it myself. So I think there's there's several ways, but there's two main ways that I do this. First of all, I try and write up fairly boring, this is everything I know and how I know it type of documents. So masses and masses of footnotes, but very much they were born, they had these children, they got married because it is sometimes in that order, and then they died.
Okay.
And this is where they lived and this is what they did, that sort of thing. And then I try to rewrite those stories with the context and make them a bit more interesting. That's where I haven't quite kept up with things as well as I might, I have to say.
Well, I think I probably haven't done either of those, so you're ahead of me on this one.
But I'm a lot older than you, so you've got plenty of time.
You're the president of the Family History Federation.
I am, yes.
What exactly does the Federation do?
Well, the Federation is an umbrella organisation that tries to work for the benefit of family history societies, help them with all sorts of things, help them with promotion, trying to encourage people to join family history societies. There are get-togethers that are now on Zoom where you can meet. If you're a treasurer of a family history society, you might be able to exchange information with other treasurers and share problems and solutions and that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. So it's very much a support mechanism for family history societies. I was involved before. I was involved, I suppose, in the 90s as what was then an executive committee member. They're called trustees now, in charge of the education. So that was much more hands-on. I just sit back and tell everyone I'm the president now, really.
Nice.
And support them rather than actually doing very much. But yes.
Oh, I'm sure that's not true. Now, in recent years, you have published some novels as well.
Yes.
What made you enter this world of fiction, and actually how much of that is fiction?
First of all, I'd written some non-fiction and I'd kind of run out of ideas of where I wanted to go next. So I had all these ideas that, one day, like most people, one day I'll write a book. And I had an idea it was going to be some kind of fairly witty novel with a bit of a genealogical twist. And then a story which was related to my one name study that's the one I help with rather than the one I'm registered to. The story came up and hit me really and sort of demanded to be told. So when you say how much is true, most of it,
okay,
the facts are true. What I've had to do, obviously, is fill in gaps. And I've done that by trying to, what I actually know about the characters, I've tried to use that information to make common sense judgments about how they might have behaved in other situations. So it's very much a based on fact novel, as is the second one. That was slightly different. The first one was set the early years of the 20th century. The other one, I've gone back to the 17th century because obviously I had all the social history for that at my fingertips. So I went there and people keep saying, when are you going to do another one?
Yes.
And at the moment, I don't have plans for another one. There might be another one, but it's got to be something that I really want to write. And at the moment, I haven't got that. I'm too busy trying to write up the family history as it is, rather than making up something, as it were.
Yeah, I was just wondering, I wonder what period the third book could be in. Do you have any kind of feeling for that?
I had a couple of sort of maybes. There was a Victorian murder in the village where I used to live, which quite appealed, or there kind of appealed something to do with Huguenots. My children have Huguenot ancestors that ended up in Guernsey.
Okay.
And that sort of half appealed, but neither of those is going anywhere anytime soon.
Fair enough. Well, you've got a slight exclusive there, listeners, as to what the next book or books are going to be. So we'll have to wait, I'm afraid. Janet, where do you think or hope the family history industry might go next?
The trouble is it's changing so quickly, and we're having to take on board all sorts of new things. DNA was a new thing. AI is now, I suppose, the latest buzzword, and how we can use that for benefit rather than anything else, how we can use it ethically.
Yep.
I think we will be concentrating more on stories as I talk to younger family historians. I think there is very much a search for identity. Perhaps they're trying to explain their own feelings, issues, behaviour by looking at their families. I think there will be less emphasis on biological family, because families don't look the same as they would have done 50, 100 years ago.
Yeah, it's true.
So I think we've got to take that into account as well. And I think the bottom answer is we can't possibly predict. I mean, who would predict it 20, 30, 40 years ago that we would be where we are now, and how we can communicate and how we can access records and things. The records don't change.
No, that's true.
The records that we're looking at from the 19th century have always been there. What's changed is how we access them, what we do with them, and how we communicate what we find, for good and ill. I wouldn't want instant access and getting documents online and so forth to go away, but I think we do lose things by doing it like that. I think it's Dave Annell who called it click and collect, and that's what people do. It means there's an awful lot of bad genealogy going on.
Yeah.
And of course, often those who are just starting out don't realise that it's bad genealogy, and they graft these ridiculous family trees to their own without really thinking it through. And I think that's part of the problem. I think we lose part of the context, because you go and you put your ancestor's name in one of the big data providers, and out pops your ancestor in the 1881 census. Whereas, I hate to keep saying, in the old days, but in the old days, you'd sit and you'd wind your way through the whole of, in my case, Hackney, looking for that Mr. Smith. And as you were doing so, you picked up an impression of what the community was like. You got a feel if there was a load of people that had migrated in from another particular place, or if what the occupational profile was, how overcrowded the housing was. We don't do that anymore. We just look at our ancestor. And the same with a burial register. You look at your ancestors. So you're not aware, is this someone who habitually tells you if it's an infant burial? Because if it is, then you can assume that if there's no infant attached to it, then that's an adult. And we don't tend to do that anymore, because there's our ancestor. Why would we look either side?
Yeah, I mean, and there's so much that we don't get to see online, because I guess in a way it's just not commercially viable for the big providers to scan and index those items, where they could actually be a complete game-changing discovery within an archive.
Absolutely. And I think that's only going to get worse. Certainly archivists I've spoken to, often they've got 25% of their material isn't catalogued.
Yeah.
So nobody even knows it's there, let alone, well, then the next step is you've got to arrange a visit to that place, and you've got to know what you're doing a little bit, and maybe struggle with a bit of paleography and so on and so forth. So there's all those wonderful nuggets of information. And it's often the really fascinating bits, because, as you say, it's the niche sources that are not commercially viable. And there they are. And I think actually that's where family history societies can come in, because family history societies, providing they've got a body of volunteers, so volunteer for your family history society folks, they can index those slightly more obscure records and make us aware of them, at least, rather than necessarily being able to make them visually available. At least we know they're there.
Yeah.
And this particular person is mentioned in it. So I think that's a bonus for family history societies, if they can get volunteers to do that sort of work.
Last question. What does family history mean to you personally?
It's taken over my life entirely, I think. So the majority of my friends are people that I've met through family history. I spend the majority of my time on family history, not necessarily just my own. And people say, well, aren't you supposed to be retired? And I'm like, what's that? Well, how many hours a week do you work? And I'm like, well, 24 hours a day, every waking minute, or because how much of what I do, even if I don't directly get paid for it, which I think is what people mean, it's all part of building up contacts and knowledge and so on in order to do the things that I do to get paid. So, is it 100 hours a week? Is it 5 hours a week? Very difficult to say. But it's definitely, it's my life. There's very little else, to be honest.
Okay, on that note, we'll move on to the next section. Ooh, time for a little advert break. One day, someone in your family will want to know who you were. Not just your name, but your voice, your story, your memories. And that's why Ancestry exists. It's a private, secure place to preserve the things that don't belong in a family tree. The stories behind the photos, the voices, the moments that explain who someone really was. Nothing is public, nothing is social, just something built to last for the people who come after you. If that matters to you, you can begin for free at ancestry.com. That's ANCESTORII.com. Sometimes fascinating stories can lurk silently in the branches of your family tree. They're just waiting for someone like you to start researching and discover them. So, with this in mind, it's time for my guest to pick one of their most fascinating relatives that they've researched and then share their life story. Okay, Janet, who are you going to introduce us to?
Well, this was a really, really difficult choice. Because of my interest in women's history, I felt it had to be a woman. So I've gone for my great-great-grandmother, who is called Ann Stratford.
Okay.
And I've had a particular connection with Anne, so I thought it had to be her, really.
Okay, so where does Anne's story start?
Well, I think the reason why she fascinates me so much is that it turned out that her childhood home was actually a road that I had lived in myself for 3 years. And at the time I lived there, I got absolutely no clue that I got ancestry in that county. I had started my family history, this is the mid-80s, but I hadn't discovered any ancestry in Buckinghamshire, which is where it was, partly because my uncle had told me that they came from Cumberland, but, there we go, never believe family stories. And so, of course, that was a bit of a hair stand up on the back of your neck moment to realise that this is actually the road she had lived in.
Okay.
The houses she would have lived in would long since gone, but that was where she lived. So she grew up in a little village called Aston Clinton, which is between Tring in Hertfordshire and Aylesbury. It's on what's now the A41. And she was born in 1834 and she died in 1911. So her story completely spans the Victorian and Edwardian eras.
Yep.
And it was a poor family. It was a rural area. Now, of course, it's a suburb, I suppose, of Aylesbury. Very much a community dependent on agriculture. And because it was a poor community, the families were very much dependent on the women in particular doing work at home. So piecework. And in Buckinghamshire, there's a lot of lace making, but there is also a lot of straw plaiting, and they're making plait for the straw hat trade, which centres, of course, on Luton. Yep. And Anne's family were involved in this. And really her life not only spans that Victorian Edwardian era, but it also spans the era when domestic straw plait trade was at its height. And so she saw the sort of the rise and demise, I suppose, of the straw plait trade.
Yeah, all change.
So when she was born, sort of 1834, it was a time of agricultural depression. We've just had the swing riots sweeping across the south of the country, including Buckinghamshire, which is really a series of protests led by agricultural labourers following a series of bad harvests. And they were complaining about the introduction of threshing machines, which obviously impacted on employment opportunities for the agricultural labourers. Yeah. They wanted better conditions. They were often being hired on very short-term contracts. So virtually day labouring rather than having continuity of employment. And that therefore meant that they're going to have to find their own accommodation, because if you've got a contract, then often a cottage will come with that job. But this isn't necessarily the case in this area. So we've got these rioters targeting anyone that they perceive to be rich, targeting people like the overseers of the poor, the vicar, the perceived wealthy farmers, and so on. And I don't know if her family was involved in that. The surname is Stratford, and certainly the Stratfords never were accused in court of anything like that.
Yep.
Her father had been in court. He'd been in court just before she was born for petty theft. But when you look at what he was stealing, which is turnips and firewood, you start to think, well, this is just crimes of need, really, rather than greed.
Yeah, they were desperate times.
She was one of 5 children, but 2 younger children died in infancy, and her mother died of tuberculosis when Anne was 6.
Oh.
Her father left with 3 young children, understandably married again almost immediately to a 19-year-old, and there were no further children.
Okay.
But they were making money out of plaiting straw. And these are the years known as the hungry 40s, I suppose. Their local plait market was in Tring, but in 1846, a new market opened up in Aylesbury, the other side of the village, about 3 or 4 miles away. And there's a report of that first market in the press, and it turns out that 20 children under the age of 12 at that market were given monetary prizes for their plait. And my great-great-grandmother Anne was one of those.
Oh, nice.
And I have tried straw plaiting. I did it as part of an experimental archaeology course, which was brilliant and fascinating. And it's really hard. To be fair, I can't do it in quite the way she would have done it, because the straw that she would have used was different. Straw now, of course, is grown to have all the goodness in the ear. And if you're plaiting straw, you want nice long straws, which in this country certainly we don't get. So she was plaiting at a very, very young age, and that's normal. The plait girls, as they were called, were taught in plait schools. The word school gives the impression that they're being taught to read and write.
Yeah.
They're not. They're being taught to plait straw, and that is it.
Oh, okay.
There's a lady called Veronica Main, who's the sort of expert, I suppose, on straw plait. And she's found instances of 18-month-olds being taught to plait.
Wow.
And again, when you think plait, you think plaiting someone's hair, there's 3 strands and one goes over and then the other one goes over. But this is much more complicated. These are 7, 9-strand plaiting, I suppose. And if you were good at it, you could earn more than your agricultural labouring husband, maybe even twice as much, but you would have to produce an awful lot. And normally the whole family were involved, so the young children were doing the basic bits and maybe threading in the ends of the straws or something like that. And the more adept plaiters were doing the complicated patterns and earning more. They sold the plait by the score, so each week the plait man would call, he would deliver the raw materials for the next week, take what you'd done and pay you, and he'd pay you 7 pence a score. So if you produced a dozen score in a week, you're going to be earning as much as your agricultural labouring husband. But the plaiting women had a really bad reputation, and thought was that this was detracting from their domestic duties. So a series of books that I recommend to almost everybody doing family history are the volumes, there's one for each county, called The General View of Agriculture. So you'll get the general view of agriculture for the county of, in this case, Buckinghamshire, with reasons for its improvement, or words to that effect. And they were drawn up between about 1790 and 1810. And they are absolutely full of information. However, they do include rather judgmental comments about the plait ladies. Women and children here make great earnings by making lace and plaiting straw, unfortunately to the disadvantage of agriculture. For whilst they can earn by such work from 7 shillings to 30 shillings a week, this is at a time when agricultural labourers are about 7 shillings, it can scarce be expected that they would undertake work in the field. And They go on, there's lots of governmental reports about women in agriculture.
Yep.
So I've got an 1882 report. The Plaiters are a sadly untidy and unthrifty set of people, scarcely knowing how to do a stitch of needlework or cook a potato, addicted to making a cup of tea and eating dry bread and butter if they can afford it.
Ouch.
There was also a rumour really, or a perception that Platt women were far more likely to have illegitimate children. That's a very bold statement. Those who have investigated this in some detail, and there's a gentleman called Laszlo Groff who's written a now out of print and extremely expensive book about straw plaiting. It wasn't expensive at the time, but it's one of those that you occasionally get on a book-selling site for an enormous amount of money, but really, really useful if you've got straw plaiting ancestry. And he studied this in a lot of detail, and actually there isn't a correlation, or possibly any kind of correlation that there is due to a different factor. They're not having illegitimate children because they're plaiting straw. Other people said they were, and reports will say, well, they're all wandering around with young men because you can plait straw and walk about, and they're all out on the common, and oh my goodness, what's going to happen?
How terrible.
And yeah. Having said that, my Anne's eldest brother was born out of wedlock, and she too had an illegitimate daughter. She did marry within weeks to the person that is the father, and DNA would suggest that that really is the case. And she went on to have 9 children. When she married, she moved from Aston Clinton to Little Kimble, which is another rural Buckinghamshire village depending on agriculture. Her husband helped the family income by joining the militia. So there was a Militia Act in 1852 because at the time there were lots of fears that we were about to be invaded by the French. And so they tried to recruit sufficient volunteers to act a bit like today's territorial army, to sort of stand by in case of invasion, I suppose. How they thought the French were going to invade Buckinghamshire is nobody's guess. But anyway, got rather a lot of other counties to go through first, presuming they're going to land somewhere on the coast.
Yeah, 1 or 2.
So it must have been a very hard life. I've identified what I believe is the cottage that she would have lived in with her husband and her 9 children, all of whom survived to adulthood, which I think in the mid-19th century, that's some achievement.
Yeah.
The cottage has now been knocked into what was 2 is now all 1, and it was small. So probably, they would probably have had about 4 rooms with their 9 children, and they even found room for a lodger at one point. And Anne did continue to plait straw. Now, we know women's occupations are underrepresented in the census, but there she is, plaiting straw, not mentioned any occupation in 1871, 81 and 91 censuses. But 1901, back there plaiting straw. And I'm absolutely convinced she wouldn't have stopped for 3 decades. But it was just seen as, well, this is women's work. This is insignificant. I'm not going to mention that.
Do you think that maybe I don't want to call it fashion, but the trend of plaiting straw was bigger kind of earlier on in those censuses and then kind of maybe declined a bit and then came back?
Well, I think it just declined, to be honest. There were 2 problems. One, of course, as you say, is fashion changes. So the fashion for straw bonnets and straw hats declined a bit.
Okay.
But also, and this applies to all sorts of things, foreign imports come in, and cheaper foreign imports. So certainly by the end of the 19th century, the numbers of women involved in plaiting had really declined, but Anne kept going. Yeah. When you look at her daughters, and she had 6 daughters, including the one that she had before marriage, and only one of them, the eldest one, ever seems to have plaited straw. The others went into dressmaking or domestic service or that kind of thing. But it's what Anne knew, and I guess she was good at it. And so she was able to boost the family income in that way. But certainly it was not a trade that carried on into the 20th century in any great degree at all. And in fact, it's now a red-listed craft. So there are so few people who know how to do it that it is a red-listed craft. And I'm certain that my efforts at it are not going to help that and are not going to lift it, because I really did find it extremely difficult. It also has health hazards associated with it. The plait schools, you've got to imagine, these are held in somebody's cottage. So you're sitting there with very poor lighting, and they would use what were called chaddy pots. They're like charcoal heaters to warm the room. That was particularly important actually for the lace makers as well, because if you've got an open fire, you're making sparks and smuts and things to make the lace dirty, but they seem to have used them in the plait schools as well.
Right.
So it was quite an unpleasant atmosphere, which led to all sorts of breathing problems. Straw needs to be kept damp to be plaited, so they put it in their mouths, which if it was dyed straw meant you ended up with a blue mouth or a red mouth. But also you ended up with lots of sores at the side of your mouth. It's also a really peculiar posture. You're very much hunched over on one side with one shoulder up and one down to keep going and doing it, walking along, which is what a lot of them would have done, because you still need to keep an eye on your children. You still need to keep an eye on your cooking pot.
Yeah, sure.
So you did end up with sort of, not exactly deformities, but muscular problems, probably arthritis and so on. So like many occupations, it did take a bit of a toll on their health. And as I say, they weren't well thought of, the plaiting women. And I think it's partly resentment that these women were to an extent independent, because they got this way of earning money, and good money if they were willing to put the hours in. Yeah. And we find that with other women's trades as well, that there was resentment. And that's, I suppose, part of the sexist nature of society at the time, that their contribution wasn't valued. In fact, it was denigrated. It wasn't just, we don't value this. It's, well, this is something that we're not happy with at all, because my goodness, she can't cook a potato and she's ignoring her husband and she's not attending to her domestic duties as she should. And I think that's very, very sad.
That perhaps shows just how good they were at it.
Yes, I think it does. Yes.
That people were outwardly going, you are terrible, you
Absolutely.
are disreputable, you are doing all these terrible things, why are you doing this and this? So yeah, they must have been very good at plait making.
I think that's very true. And she died of exhaustion in the workhouse in 1911. So a sad story, a story that's got gaps, because that's the nature of the thing. But I think it is a shame and it is a sad story. And there we are.
Not surprised she died of exhaustion if she was constantly plaiting away. And I have seen some plaits and I'm thinking, I have absolutely no idea how to make one of those and how long it must have taken to make one of those. So, I have every respect for her skills and in her craft, but I have no idea. I'd be useless at that.
Well, as I say, I was definitely useless at it.
Do you have photographs of her, or?
I have one very blurry photo of her. Yes, that was sent to me in old age with her daughter. What I don't have, actually, is a photograph of the daughter of hers from which I descend. I have photos of the other four, but not my great-grandmother.
Oh.
In fact, I've just tried something with the other great-grandmother for whom I have no photograph, which is the other one on my father's side. And I did ask AI to create a photograph using the photographs of the relatives that I have got photographs of, if you see what I mean.
Interesting, yeah.
And I'm being very, very careful not to share that, because the danger is that suddenly everybody...
Yeah, because it's not fact.
No. And I won't even share it with, this is created by AI, splattered all over it, because someone will take that out. It was a fascinating exercise. But yes, I do have a very blurry photo of her in a straw bonnet.
Yeah, I was going to ask whether you had any examples or any treasured plaited items that you're aware of any.
Well, I have what I created as part of my course, which looks more like a fruit bowl than a hat. And I did buy a straw splitter. So the straws weren't plaited whole. You had to split it vertically, which is not easy before you can plait it.
My goodness, this just gets more complicated.
Yeah, it's not easy. I did, in fact, plait when I was doing it. I did it with whole straws, but that would have done it with split straws.
Wow. Well, thank you, Janet, for telling us the story of Ann Stratford. But I think it's now time for you to face the brick wall. Oh, those dreaded brick walls are so infuriating. You're having a lovely evening, finding loads of newly discovered relatives, and then bam, up goes the brick wall and you're left hanging, sometimes for hours, days, weeks, or even years, wondering what's behind it. Yes, it's that part of the show where my guest shares one of their brick walls in a hope that you, dear listener, can help to make a breakthrough. Right, Janet, what have you got for us?
Well, again, it was difficult to choose because we all have many brick walls. As soon as we can't find someone's parents, there's a brick wall.
Yes, yeah.
As soon as you solve it, it creates two more.
Yeah.
It's funny, isn't it? Some brick walls are kind of the big ones, the ones that are more frustrating than others. And I've had 4 for several decades. One, in fact, I solved, and it took me 37 years, so don't give up, folks. And in fact, another one I solved earlier this year.
Well done.
And when I say solved, I think often what we find, it's not that we can't find someone, is that we maybe find 3 people and which is it? Or it's like, well, I'm pretty sure it's this, but I personally don't feel I have enough evidence to support that. And this brick wall is a little bit like that. And I've chosen the brick wall that stops me having the full house of 32 3 times great-grandparents.
Yeah, okay.
Because it starts with my great-great-grandmother, who was called Mary Cardell. Now, she consistently spelt it Cardell, but clearly you can spell it with an A, with an E on the end, all sorts of things. The documents from her later life, so censuses, her marriage, her death, her burial, are all convinced that she was born in Highgate in Middlesex. If all the ages are absolutely correct, and they probably aren't, I can tell you she was born on the 4th or 5th of April in 1817. But let's say, 1816 to 1818. She is unusually consistent about both birthplace and age. According to her marriage certificate, her father was a James Cardell, a gardener, and the witnesses were a Catherine Cardell and a William Groves. Now, there's no indication whether James Cardell was alive at that point, and I've looked at the register, and that particular incumbent doesn't note that. So none of the fathers for several entries either side. So we don't know from that.
Yeah. And
she married in 1841. Just before the 1841 census. She's missing from the 1851 census. So if anyone can find her and her husband Philip Woolgar, Woolgar, in 1851, that would be nice. So where do you go? Well, you go to the baptism registers for Highgate, don't you? Well, except she's not there. And then we look at the nonconformist chapel in Highgate, and no, she's not there either. And what do you do then? Well, you think about who's this Catherine Cardell that's the marriage witness. Great believer in looking at marriage witnesses. And I thought perhaps she might be her mother. And it turns out, cutting a very long story and hours and hours and hours of research over many years short, she's her sister. And in fact, Catherine Cardell then has a relationship with the other marriage witness. And Catherine Cardell does marry, but not him. And she too says her father is called James Cardell, a gardener.
Right, okay.
Consistent. Great. And we know when she was born, and she's supposed to be born in Highgate as well. And needless to say, there's no baptism for her either. There were a couple of burials close by. One I ruled out, a Lucretia Cardell. It's not her, she's not a sibling. But there was a young Eliza Cardell who was buried in Hornsey with Highgate as the abode. So she would have been born about 1820, and I suspect she's another sibling. But, of course, guess what? There's no baptism for her either. Oh. And then I found in Highgate something I rather liked. There was 1813, so just before Catherine probably was born, there was a James Cadwell, Cadwell, marrying a Mary Ann Guttridge. I thought, this is great,
Yep.
And I had great fun with them, particularly old Mary Ann Guttridge. She's related to a royal clockmaker, the vicar of a Devon parish just up the road. She had a Huguenot connection. She had an ancestor who was captured by pirates, a poet, an inventor of an early form of shorthand. I mean, fascinating ancestor, but unfortunately not mine.
Someone else's, yeah.
Yeah, I was so close to inking her in and saying this, and I think a lot of people would have done so.
Yeah.
And then I just went back and looked at the witnesses on the marriage of that Mary Ann Guttridge and James Cadwell. And by following that up, it was quite clear that these were not my ancestors. So all those lovely things, I'm out of this world compared to most of my ancestors, not mine. So the next thing is, can I find James Cardell? And actually, it's a more common surname than perhaps you'd think.
I've never heard it before.
No, you wouldn't think so. But given that we're in and around London, that doesn't help either. And I looked at every burial of a James Cardell. I looked at all the James Cardells in 1841 and 1851 censuses. And again, obviously missing out a load of, hard work. There was a burial, which I quite liked, in Southwark in 1824, suggesting a birth in about 1775. And that's kind of where it stopped. It could be him, it could not, who knows? What's he doing in Southwark? Who knows that either? So what about a possible mother? And I did find a widowed Maria Cardell in St Pancras Workhouse, which would have covered Highgate. Mm-hmm. And she's there in 1841 and 1851. She should be there in the 1861 census, but I can't find her. And I think that they're just using initials, but I can't find her. And it says in 1851 that she was born in Dudley in Worcestershire. Well, maybe she was, maybe she wasn't, given this is information supplied by an institution.
Okay.
But a lot more research and elimination led me to a lady called Maria Withenbury, who married a James Cardell in Worcester, and that James was baptised in what was then called Drayton-on-Hales in Shropshire in 1775, nicely tying up with that Southwark burial, which I quite fancied. And they had 2 children in Worcester, a daughter that I can't trace any further, and a son who might possibly have been buried in London as a small child. So I did think that they were worth following up, because then they disappear from Worcester. And so what do I do next? Well, I fiddle about with them. I have a look. I go back in Worcestershire. It turns out that this Maria Withenbury, if this is her, and I do think it is, wasn't born in Dudley at all, but let's not go there. She was born 30 odd miles away from that, but it was worth following them up. So I followed up the parents, and there was a will for this James born in Drayton-on-Hales in 1775. His father left a will, didn't mention any children, annoying. And I looked a bit more at the Withenburys, because again, it's a nice, unusual name. Let's see where we go with that.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that one either.
There was also, back in London, another James Cardell, and I came across him obviously because he was called James, but he was much younger, and I think he's another child. One of the marriage, this is so complicated how anyone's following this, I don't know, but he married in London, and one of the marriage witnesses, so back to marriage witnesses again, was a Hawthorne, and there is a Hawthorne-Withenbury marriage, but I can't tie the 2 together. She was married. She wasn't called Hawthorne. As a witness, she was a Mrs. Braids by then, but she had been a Hawthorne.
Right, okay.
So that's possibly another sibling. And where do we go here? Well, then we find a Sarah Cardell, A-double-L, born, and I know exactly when she was born, the 22nd of January 1811, to James and Maria in St Margaret's in Westminster. But she married under age, so she had to have consent of parents. And there is a document saying this, signed by Maria Cardell, who was also a witness to that marriage. Yeah. Now, the fact that the mother has signed implies that the father is dead by that time.
Yeah.
OK, I've only got the Maria bit to go on, but the signature of that Maria Cardell is consistent with the Maria Withenbury signature on the marriage parish register. So we're not ruling out this Sarah. This Sarah has descendants. and several grandchildren. So at the moment, I'm living in hope of a DNA match. In fact, I have got one, but it's so tiny that I'm just not quite there with it to say that's best I can do. Interestingly, having investigated the Withenbury family further, because I know we start with what we know, we don't leap back to what we wish were our ancestors, but sometimes going back a little bit and coming back forward does give you mentions in wills and that kind of thing, which is helpful.
Yeah.
If that James Cardell and Maria Withenbury are the next generation, are my 3 times great-grandparents, their parents were called James, Elizabeth, Samuel and Sarah, all of which feature in the next generation and the possible children. They're not unusual names. That's the problem. So you can't ink anything in on the grounds of that, but it's worth noting. I also followed up Maria Withenbury's half-brother, who emigrated to Connecticut. And there are photographs of his daughter online. Now, again, this is not something which is going to break down the brick wall, but when you start to add together all the little bits of evidence, it's another little bit of evidence. But this particular lady has very, very distinctive, very large ears. Now, this is going to sound ridiculous, isn't it? But if I look at the photographs that I have, I've got a photograph of Mary Cardell, my 2 times great-grandmother, but she's wearing a hat, so you can't see her ears. But I've got photographs of her 3 daughters who have very, very distinctive, very large ears. Now, apparently, this is a dominant genetic trait. Can I add them to my family tree on the basis of that? No, I can't. But it's just something else that might possibly be a clue. If I can just get a slightly bigger DNA match, and when I say small, I mean, I think it's 12 centimorgans or something. It's going to be pushing it at that distance, but with my lack of relatives, to me, anything above 20 centimorgans is a big DNA match as far as I'm concerned. So that's where I stand. So if anyone can find Philip and Mary Woolgar in the 1851 census, they move at some point from Highgate to Mitcham in Surrey, and I don't know whether that would be before or after that census. I think probably after, so I'd expect her still to be in the Highgate kind of area, Finsbury, that sort of area. That would be wonderful.
Have the boundaries of Highgate changed at all?
I think they seem to be, Highgate seems to be lumped in with Hornsey at various times. I think they're not enumerated, or that bit has been destroyed. Because, believe me, I've tried everything. I've tried looking for birthplace and age only and no name. I've tried, one of the daughters is called Caroline, and she would have been 8 at the time. So that's a little bit more unusual. So I've looked at all the Carolines. I've really played about with it. I haven't just put in Woolgar and variants and hoped. So I don't think they're enumerated. But there we are. And if anyone's got Sarah Thornton, who I think might be my Mary's sister, it's one of their descendants as well, I'd like you to do a DNA test, please, because that would be really helpful. We live in hope.
That's the spirit. So if you've got ancestors who are Cardell or have perhaps even big ears, or you have some DNA that could help Janet, then this could be your moment to help her break her brick wall. So what's the best way for listeners to make contact if they think they have a clue or a research idea?
Well, some of my family stories are on my Granny's Tales website. And on there also is a write-up of this brick wall. So if you want to study this in detail, then maybe that's the way to go. It's grannystales.co.uk. And on there's a contact us button, so you can contact me that way.
Perfect. Of course, listeners can head over to familyhistoriespodcast.com, where they can read this episode's show notes and send us a message. Or they can just email us at hello@familyhistoriespodcast.com, and we'll pass the message along to Janet. Now, while the listeners frantically scribble all of that down, it's just possible that I can help you with this one, but you'll need to follow me through to the garage.
Sounds intriguing. Crikey, what's all this?
This, Janet, is my secret time machine.
A secret time machine? Wow, is it real?
It sure is. It's a highly technical, fully functional masterpiece of modern science and technology.
This is amazing.
Isn't it? I don't suppose you'd like a quick little trip back in time to try and solve that brick wall for yourself? You'd be back before you know it.
I'd love to, but what if it goes wrong? Do you have insurance?
Insurance? No.
I'm not so sure now.
Oh, come on. If anything goes wrong with a time machine, you just go back in time to before it went wrong and do it again until it goes right.
Well, I guess that makes sense. Do I have to pick a date?
Yep, just take a seat and then let me know when and where you'd like to go.
Well, I think I'd better go back to where Mary and her husband were living in Mitcham in 1861 in the census, and then I can ask her about her childhood and her parents.
Sounds like a great idea. There we go. Mitcham. Yep, all set. Oh, you'll need this. It's a temporal beacon. Keep it with you at all times. It's your ticket home. When you're ready to come back, just tap that big button on the top and you'll be here in a flash.
This one?
That's the one. Right, here we go. Dr. Janet Few. Thank you, goodbye, and good luck. Mitcham, yep. Adelaide, Australia. Oh, so close. The Family Histories podcast was presented and produced by me, Andrew Martin. My guest was the brilliant Dr. Janet Few, and if you've enjoyed this episode, then why not share it with a friend? Or even a complete stranger, I don't mind. Thank you for listening. Approximately no family historians were harmed in the making of this podcast.